The commission is really three commissions in one. First of all, it's an ICAC. It's an anti-corruption commission for the public sector. Secondly, it's a police misconduct commission. It arose out of not the WA Inc. Royal Commission, that was its predecessor, the Anti-Corruption Commission, but out of the Police Royal Commission in 2001-2003. And our jurisdiction in relation to police is wider than our jurisdiction in relation to the public sector. And thirdly, we're a crime commission. So I just want to say a couple of words about those two and then concentrate on the public sector commission part. We had crime in our name from the beginning, and police can apply for special powers, and that's an exceptional powers ruling. Back when we started with controlled operations, which of course are technically illegal unless approved, governments around Australia gave the authority to start those to a body such as this. About 2012, a lot of those powers moved to the Commissioner of Police. We maintain a monitoring role over that, which keeps us very busy. But the only exceptional power now that is left, and the police have to jump through so many hoops that it's almost impossible, is the power to summon people in for examination prior to charge. So if you have reluctant witnesses, which happened with one of the many instances down at the multiplex, reluctant witnesses can be brought in, and I'd like to say forced to give evidence, but of course in that case the bikies' code of silence triumphed, and so they were charged with contempt of court, and the Chief Justice slotted all of them for 2 years or more. So it's a very useful power, but the legislation needs to make it easier for police to use. So we weren't really a crime commission until 1918, when Parliament transferred to us or empowered us to do unexplained wealth and criminal benefits investigations. And that is what we now do. It's a big part of our work. And the significance of it is I can't tell you really much about it because we're bound by confidentiality undertakings to the court. But we do have millions of dollars frozen. So you don't actually see much of our work, but it is very, very active. So now to all of you, or most of you, the Public Sector Commission. I'm going to bore you with some stats. This year so far, we've received 1,140 allegations. You all should know this, but I'll just briefly go through it. Our jurisdiction is a jurisdiction for what is called serious misconduct. It's almost interchangeable with corruption because the definition under Section 4 of our Act, the definition of serious misconduct is more or less identical to two sections of the Criminal Code about corruption. Taking a bribe is obvious, and the other is abuse of office in some way. I'll come to some of those. Any person may notify us of misconduct. An allegation of misconduct should have reasonable grounds to suspect. And so just somebody writing in says, Premier Cook is corrupt. Is it an allegation? Well, no, because there's no reasonable grounds to suspect. Unless it's got material with it, it's pretty pointless. I'm sure most of you, particularly the integrity agencies, get a lot of people like that. We're just one in the port of call. When I was DPP, I always used to smile at letters that began to the Governor-General, to the Premier, to the Prime Minister, and somewhere down was me. Well, you've all had those, I suspect. We get a lot of notifications from agencies as appropriate authorities. You are required to notify us of a reasonable suspicion of misconduct. And that was put in because in the past, may still happen, heaven forbid, people would be shuffled round. You'd have a problem child who you suspected but couldn't quite land a blow on, so you'd move them somewhere. Well, now, or, oh, look, Fred, you know, my wife's sick and I'm going to pay the money back. Oh, well, okay, but don't do it again. Well, now that person, that supervisor, would be committing an offence if they didn't report it. It's a very important corruption prevention measure. Of the 1,140 matters we received, we formed a reasonable suspicion in about 37%, and we referred 50, I told you this is boring, I referred 58% back to agencies for outcome. When I came into this job, the Commission still was in the habit of issuing stop notices under our Act, you know, don't do anything. We'd then take 3 or 4 months to assess it, by which time you could have got on and dealt with it. So we very, very rarely issue stop notices now, and only for really good reasons relating to an investigation. We expect you to carry on and do what you have to do. Which brings me to a point, because we refer most of these back to you, that indicates 2 things. First is, we are not the principal corruption fighters in Western Australia. Directors General, Commissioners of Police, other commissioners are the corruption fighters. You should all have corruption prevention plans. You should all have risk mitigations. If you're not using Australian Standard 8001 on fraud prevention, you should be. The Auditor General has put out a very handy guide, best practice guide, and if you haven't got one, download it and start on it. Corruption prevention is a risk, or corruption is a risk. And like every other risk, it can be managed. Can it be completely ruled out? Of course not. But you have work health safety corruption or prevention plans, add in this. And have mature conversations at senior level. What is your appetite for risk in the corruption space? Because every accountability measure has a price. The example I often use is most government departments, I don't know whether they do now, did when I started, would have government issue pens, biros and so forth, which people would book off and take home and so forth. Technically, I suppose, stealing. Would you mount an investigation if you came into work and found 1 pen short? No. Why? Because it's just not worth it. The cost of doing something is greater. So you'd have an appetite for that risk. If it was $50,000, one hopes that you might not. I say one hopes because the main themes that I now come to were unlawful computer access, corrupt use of position for benefit, timesheet fraud, and unauthorised disclosure. I said we're a police misconduct commission. We received 1,234 notifications, and most of those came from police. Sometimes we get dual notifications from the police and a person who reports to it, or the Aboriginal Legal Service. We found a reasonable suspicion of police misconduct, which, by the way, is wider than just the corruption element for the public sector. 36, we formed a reasonable suspicion of, and we referred 56 back for police action and outcome. The main themes were breach of policy or procedure, neglect of duty, unprofessional conduct, and assault or unlawful use of force. Unlawful use of force or excessive use of force, it may not be unlawful, is a fairly constant theme with police. We usually refer it back, A, because you are the corruption fighters, we're not your backstop, you are the corruption fighters, and B, because most of these really are more matters of discipline than actual criminal behaviour. Some of the things we've seen before getting on some cases: conflicts of interest, either declared, undeclared, mismanaged or ignored. Does this ring a bell? I'll bet it does for all of you. I don't know what it is about conflicts of interest. A conflict of interest is not corruption. It may be evidence of corruption, but it is not of itself corruption. If it was, we'd probably get rid of half the public service. Lack of transparency and documentation was a recurring theme in our investigations. Over-reliance on internal controls without verification. Keep bringing up Paul White, he's the gift that keeps giving. But he was the indenting officer. He purchased the service. He authorised the payment. I mean, that went on for 10 years. So we all know that's wrong. But we're still finding departments where that's happening. Poor governance and oversight. It starts from the top. So let me give you a few particular examples, because I will leave some time for questions. And I have a habit, if I haven't got any questions thrown at me, I'll throw a few back at you. Keeps you on your toes. So often, you've probably read our reports. We try and write these reports as much as anything. When I'm writing a report, I'm thinking of who the audience is, and the audience always includes directors general and heads of integrity departments within authorities. We always, what are the wider lessons? We could spend all our time on investigating in misconduct, but we try and pick things that have a wider lesson that hopefully you read and say, oh, glad we didn't do that. And then you think, maybe I'd just better inquire and see if that is actually the case here. And sometimes it is. So Operation Stremoy was a senior officer who was leaving the job, downloaded 591 documents, including highly sensitive government information, like cabinet submissions, used a USB device, and left for a private sector job. In the end, we didn't find misconduct. We found a huge misconduct risk. Reason in the end we didn't find misconduct is that I personally think that he chickened out. I'm sure he took it to give to his new employer, who was in the same area of business that he was, but he didn't, and he destroyed it. So in the end, no harm was done. But watch when people leave. When people are leaving, particularly if they're in a sort of niche market, IT, this was valuation of land, all sorts of niche markets. And where do people go? Well, the hollowing out of the public sector, they go to somebody who then has a contract to provide exactly the same services. And so if they take some of the secrets, they've got a leg up for later quotes. So watch that. Now, we did find his explanation was implausible, but as I say, we don't go out to find misconduct. We go out to find whether there was misconduct. So some of the red flags: unmonitored use of USB devices. I don't know how many of you allow USB devices. We don't here. You can't do that here. So unmonitored use, no policy in relation to it, weak confidentiality agreements, no exit interview, no obligation to keep confidentiality. It was just assumed everybody would. Well, I'm not a great believer in codes of conduct, quite frankly. People will breach them, but at least if they breach them, you've got a disciplinary basis for taking action. If you haven't got that, you haven't got anything. So the department fixed a lot of the problem, but it's quite serious because we all know there are some things which are highly sensitive, such as cabinet submissions. that should not be let out. And this is what happened in Operation Stremoy. Procurement. State purchases about $30 billion in goods and services each year. I don't think that includes local governments. So bees like honey, people like money. Procurement will always be a major task here. So this was the late 20, it was the Midwest Ports Authority. There was a tender, it was only 1.2 million. It wasn't very big in an authority that spends hundreds of millions on the harbour. So it wasn't very big. It was 2.85 million over 3 years. There'd been a long time security firm that had done the work and another one that was bidding. Two people within the procurement team wanted the long-time person to continue. In the end, we didn't find any corruption. They didn't get any money for it or other things or gifts. But it was still, in one sense, they corrupted the process because they misrepresented what the panel had said, made up arguments for the board as to why Company A was better than Company B. The members of the procurement panel, who were independent, weren't asked by the board or knew even what went to the board. There was a PowerPoint never shown to them. There was a delegated authority to the chief executive of $1 million. This contract was more than that. Nobody picked up that it required board approval. These are all basic stuff. There was a lack of transparency in documentation, poor record keeping. You know, oh, well, poor old Fred is just a mess always. Well, mess can hide corruption in my understanding. They awarded the contract with no rationale that we could understand and didn't understand the governance rules. Now, I think that the Procurement Act in 2021 has made a huge difference and really tightened things up. It's easy to follow, it's easy to apply. What you've got to watch out for, we've seen this a couple of times, are business sections that actively avoid the procurement team. Some of your bigger departments will have procurement teams. That's their job. And we've found on a couple of occasions business sections that actively go round the procurement team because they know if it goes to the procurement team, that pesky team is probably going to follow the rules, get independent people, evaluate each contract in an appropriate way, both for value and for money, do all those nasty things that the regulations require. And we really want to hire ex-proprietary limited because, you know, we're great mates, we go to the footy, besides which we really think he'll do a better job. But the procurement team, they're just slow, they get in the way, so we'll just do things. Now, I've seen that a couple of times. Watch out for it. If you find that your procurement team is being sidelined, that is a huge red flag because it may be we're doing it for the right motives. We genuinely feel the company is the best company, or it may be we're doing it because we're getting a kickback. And in this day and age, it might surprise you that people are still putting their kickbacks in the bank. Heaven knows why, but they do. Thank heavens for us. Intellectual property. This is a big ticket item with universities and health. Although there have been some big cases, major cases in Western Australia, we still see a lack of clarity between who owns the intellectual property for something. And this intellectual property can sometimes be worth millions, if not billions. And it gets more confusing when you have somebody who is a part-time sessional member. when did they make the great breakthrough in the world-class drug? While they were working 2 days a week as a member of the health department, while they were working 1 day as a week as an adjunct professor, or they were working 3 days for a week for the pharmaceutical company. Who knows? But millions are at stake. And, the humble apple, forget what it was called, pink something, the state went to Geneva, I think, and argued about the genome of that apple because it was worth so much to the state. So intellectual property is a big ticket item. Keep an eye on it. It's a big red flag if somebody is going on their own, and in a sense, it's easily controlled by a clear contract right at the beginning. Who owns what? How, my working assumption is anything that any of us produce today belongs to the government, belongs to the state, rather, not the government, belongs to the state. It's not ours. That's because I have a bright idea and write a brilliant paper, which I'm delivering, doesn't mean that it's mine. It belongs to the state. So some of the things to look at, we send some material back to you for you to deal with and investigate. We may do a number of things. We may do nothing because you've already dealt with it or for some other reason, or it's simply not worth our resources to do more with. I'm not talking about those cases that don't reach the standard of reasonable suspicion. They're just not within our jurisdiction. And of course, people are writing in about private enterprise. We only cover public enterprise. So it's over to you in most cases. Now, some of you have agencies that have a mature misconduct investigation capability, police, education. You've got a whole area. I said accountability comes with a cost, but you have an integrity area or areas that by and large function pretty well. We will select some cases for what we call monitoring and review, and that will monitor the progress of an investigation and review it at the end. That's usually, again, fairly easy with agencies that do have that capability. They might do things that we disagree with, but we can at least negotiate and talk about and have them perhaps change their focus. The problems arise in agencies, sometimes smaller agencies, that don't have that capability. You're not there to investigate your staff. I don't blame you, but you're not. And so something comes along, something quite serious that involves potential criminality or at least serious misconduct as defined. We've sent it back to you. Where do you start? Well, we can give you some help along the way, but fundamentally it's the Director General's responsibility. So what happens in that situation? You go to an outside investigator. Who is that outside investigator likely to be? An industrial relations investigator. They're very good at investigating disciplinary offences and things of that nature. But they often don't have the skills to understand that this may be a serious fraud, that the police would put expert witnesses or expert police officers to unravel or whatever. And so this is a big issue. Your investigative capability may not be up to scratch. What's the answer? Well, I hate to say this because it sounds like an ad. There are firms that specialise in it. They cost you an arm and a leg. So you probably are going to have to pay to get it properly investigated. An easy way to avoid having to pay that, make sure you've got robust systems in the first place that uncovers it before too much damage is done. So some of the things, and I know this is the inaugural one and my last, but we have done this before. So here's some of the corruption red flags that you should be aware of, and your employee should be aware of if they see it, and they should be able to confidentially report it to someone. These are just about all we've seen in the last few years, but it's also all I've seen in the last 10 years. There's nothing magic about it. First, it starts from the top. It starts from the Director General or head, all the divisional officers, everybody. If the boss is going off to lunch 3 times a week, what message does that send to the staff? May not be corruption, but what message does it send? Oh, well, I can do that. I'll work from home, home being the nearest pub. Weak internal controls. Well, just about every case we have, as I outlined, Paul White for 10 years approved payment of his own invoices, for heaven's sake. Reluctance for any outside scrutiny. We're a close-knit team. We don't want anybody, including the boss, to actually know how we do it. We'll deliver. We have some departments we've never heard of. Now, either they're very, very good and don't represent a misconduct risk at all, or they have misconduct risks or misconduct allegations, but they've just chosen or don't know that they're obliged to report it to us. Now, this is not for the bigger agencies, this is for the little ones. And of course, it's a mantra of mine, I hate branch offices. Once you get away from the central office, then the governance needs to be really tight, and frequently it hasn't been. And close associations with the proposed vendors. In a recent case, we had 2 women. One was a public officer. We formed an opinion of misconduct. One was being paid the same, doing the same work, but went through a hire company, so they weren't a public officer. We recommended that be fixed. Anyway, they were brought on to advise about GST. They knew nothing about GST, so they went to a lawyer's firm, respectable legal firm and a respectable accounting firm, and spent thousands of dollars on advice for the next few years on matters that they should have known. And they were taken out to lunches and, gee, the Gold Coast is looking good, and suddenly there's a conference on the Gold Coast and they get taken off there. And it was all there to be seen. Nobody saw it. Why? They probably did, but it comes down to the personalities too. They're very nice, crawls to anybody above, bullies anybody below. Or else, if they have some control over wages and stuff, they pay people more than they're actually worth in the open market. Doesn't mean that you're then corrupt, but when you're thinking, you naturally, if I report him, I might lose my job and I'm not going to get another job at the same level of pay. So it's just there. Living beyond your means. Mr. Fullerton of North Metropolitan Area was part of a family that owned Western Refrigeration. They were independently wealthy. He had, his mum gave him money. He was an unusual character, if I can just digress. He was an unusual character. Mostly people take bribes and so forth for money. They're gamblers or whatever. His chief motivation, I think, was power. He would say, right, you're taking us to lunch today, and we're not going to have the $40 bottle of wine. We'll have the $400 bottle of wine. And if you don't, you're not getting any more contracts from me. I'll give it to your mate. And what are you going to do for me? Somebody paid for his and his wife's business class airfare to Canada for his own son's wedding. Could not believe that. So he was one that everybody thought, oh, well, he was, his parents are wealthy, so that's why he's got money. Paul White, anybody remember Irene White? Series of dress shops and so forth, apparently successful. No relation whatever, but everybody thought it was, and that was the source of his money and so forth for many, many years. Beware of the person who never takes holidays. We all love our job, I know, but we also like to take holidays. Beware of the person that never takes holidays. When I was a very junior solicitor, just joined Crown Law as it was then in those days, I did a case where the general manager of the Collie Hospital was renowned for his work ethic, always there day and night, doing the work. One day broke his leg. Wasn't expecting that. So they trundled him off to Bunbury Hospital and sent down an acting manager from Perth. Those were the days when you used to get your pay in little brown envelopes once a week. I'm sure none of you are old enough to remember that. But the manager came out, yeah, Jones, there you are, Smith. He was ghosting no less than 4 employees and had been doing for years. So he was just pocketing 4 lots of pay every year. Why? Because he never took holidays, so nobody could ever find out. So look for bullies. Some people are naturally bullies, but it's a good way to put people off. If I report the suspicious behaviour, then I'm going to be in all sorts of trouble. It's going to bully me out of a job and so forth. These are real fears, and you've got to create an environment in your agencies where people can speak up. So my closing remarks, and then I'm going to open up for questions both ways if necessary. My closing remarks are this. Misconduct's everyone's responsibility. I'm old enough to have lived through, and some of you are, the WA years. That was 5 years of pretty much unbridled corruption. There was also corruption in the police force. I think governments and police are a bit mirrors. Good government, good police, vice versa. Then we moved to the 90s where we cleaned all of the mess up, or as much as we could. And it coincided with the first police commissioner who did not come from the detective side. And I don't think it's a coincidence that no police officer commissioner has since come from the detectives. And things started to clean up. We had the Royal Commission, which I think was actually more important commission in some ways than the WA Royal Commission. That was the Gregor Commission on Government. That set in train a number of important anti-corruption measures, along with many other things. But time moves on. We're now in 2025. We have a government that's been dominant certainly for the last 4 years, but pretty dominant since 2017 when it attained office. It's now entered its 3rd term. 3rd terms are dangerous. There's been a hollowing out of the public service. Who will stand up and tell the minister that they are not wearing any clothes? It should be directors general and senior people, but is it? Are we doing our job in telling governments what they need to know as opposed to what they think they'd like to know? You go to a meeting with a minister, you rarely have a one-on-one. You'll have people who seem to have been born in the last decade as policy and ministerial advisors, whose sole job is to look after the minister in the media and any other way. That's not our job. You have ministers, I'm not reflecting on their competence, but they're put into an area they may never have been in before. You may have a minister who's never dropped a fishing line, suddenly Minister for Fisheries, among other things. And so we need to maintain our integrity and the integrity of our organisations, because we're in the dangerous period. There'll probably, I can't see a change in 4 years either. And then we would move into a fourth term. And any government that's been there too long, any government, is at risk of misconduct. I think that the public service is pretty good. I've now looked at it on and off for 30 odd years, apart from 16 as a judge. And on the whole, I think we've got a pretty corruption-free public service. We have pockets. You're always going to have pockets. You're always going to have rogue people. That's my same view about police. On the whole, I think we've got a pretty good police force. You're always going to get individual pockets. Body-worn cameras have been the greatest thing since sliced bread. Somebody once said, what was before sliced bread? But still. Because body-worn cameras don't lie, usually, and you've got multiple things. And a complaint of excessive use of force can be viewed in real time effectively by our assessors, by police IAU or professional standards or whoever. And not infrequently, having looked at it, we say, well, the way the complainant described it simply doesn't match with the reality. I think it's been a huge misconduct prevention measure, the cameras.